Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome. As you line in, I'll introduce myself. Everybody's joining. I can see the numbers going up. That's great. I'll pause a minute to allow people to connect. Welcome. My name is Ruth Thomas-Squance, and I am Co-Executive Director of the Build Healthy Places Network. And I'm so glad that you are here with us today for this virtual summit, Building Resilient Communities Through Multi-Sector Approaches, Navigating Climate-Driven Disasters. And before we go into today's agenda, I want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from San Francisco, the unceded territory of the Ramaytush Ohlone people and the original people of the San Francisco Peninsula, who have been custodians of this land for generations. So as I continue with this intro, please feel free to type your name, institution, affiliation, and where you are joining us from in the chat as we just wait for everyone to join. Some quick housekeeping rules while we just wait for those entering the room. Most of you are likely professors of Zoom by now, but just as a quick reminder, please use the Q&A function to suggest questions for our speakers, panelists at various points throughout the summit. And you can use the chat function for any technical difficulties that we can help troubleshoot. And then we're also going to be providing resources in the chat as well. So it's going to be Q&A for questions, chat for tech issues, and resources. So we've gathered leaders and practitioners from across community development, public health, healthcare, philanthropy, and government, because the challenge in front of us demands every one of those sectors at the table. The challenge is urgent and the solution is collaborative. And that's the thread that's going to be running through everything we'll do together today. The story of climate change, and our response to it has gone through an evolution over the past few decades. For many, it began as a pretty abstract concept of global warming that summed up pictures of melting ice and distant forests and felt very removed from the everyday lives of many across this country. And then we arrived to where we are today, navigating ever-increasing numbers of once-in-a-generation climate disasters, extreme heat, wildfires, or floods that bring the urgency of our situation and the impact of communities that many of us in this virtual room are part of or work alongside every day. We know that the reality of these events is about the impact on people and places. What it looks like is your neighborhood's ability to get fresh food from a store, whether power has been out for 3 days, whether your job pays enough for you to recover from that big storm, or climate gentrification, displacing whole communities. These are not isolated problems, and they are symptomatic of disconnected systems, the silos that we constructed to compartmentalize the complexity of our modern world often leave us missing the mark in fostering collective well-being for those we serve. We come to this meeting on climate, people and place from a multi-sector perspective, and with a shared awareness that communities and community-driven solutions must be at the center of how we build resilient community infrastructure for the future. Addressing this challenge requires a different way of working across sectors, and the kind of system thinking that benefits from a framework to help us think about it. A few years ago, Build Healthy Places Network adopted the Ripple Foundation's framework called Seven Vital Conditions for Health and Well-Being. It offers a way to name the multiple factors that people need to thrive and to organize the multi-sector approaches that we need to address them. So if you look at this graphic and focus on the left-hand side, the colorful side of this graphic, the holistic framework spans factors like safe, stable places to live, housing affordability, reliable transportation, a thriving natural world. But if you notice, at the center of the model is belonging and civic muscle. And that's not accidental. People feeling like they belong and like they have the power to shape their communities is the engine for driving change and sustainability in the other vital conditions. And it's a theme that we will hear woven throughout today's discussions. One thing I love about this framework is that it makes spatial justice visible, because we can literally map where these vital conditions exist in a community and where they don't. These gaps did not happen by chance, but were constructed by decades of choices, policies and practices that have created a sort of topography of investment that have shaped which places thrived and those which have not. Too often, low income, communities of colour, rural geographies have been excluded from the investments that strengthen these vital conditions. And this builds the kind of buffer communities need to respond and recover when climate events hit. So we can look at this framework as pointing towards the levers for change, tangible things we can shift in communities to improve health and well-being and build capacity to prepare, to respond and survive climate-related disasters. It also helps us rethink about climate, not solely as an environmental issue, but a housing issue, a transportation and a food and healthcare issue. And then this holistic view can help us see where other sectors already own pieces of the puzzle that we're trying to solve collectively. And perhaps most importantly, it points to that kind of upstream thinking that moves us from asking how we respond to the next crisis to approaching investments that embed lasting resilience in the infrastructure of a place. And this matters enormously for climate. When a disaster hits, the impact is felt not in one of those vital conditions, but across housing, across transportation and food and healthcare. And it's a trauma to the social fabric of the neighbourhood all at once. So when a community is already undersourced in those conditions before the storm arrives, the damage goes deeper, the recovery takes longer, and the cost in terms of health and well-being is higher. The communities that have been disinvested for decades carry the heaviest burden of climate-driven disasters. They often live in neighbourhoods with older housing stock, less insulation perhaps, fewer grocery stores and less access to capital for recovery. But before we get stuck in that gloom, it's important that we also hold the parallel truth that these communities possess a remarkable combination of strengths to build on. They have strong social fabric, close-knit networks of family, neighbours and mutual support. Anchor institutions like community centres, libraries, schools and faith organisations that can hold people together in hard times. Rich culture and artistic life that carries identity and pride. And they have a hard-won adaptability, that sort of creativity and resilience that emerges when people have had to solve hard problems for a long time, often without a lot of outside help. So their real expertise is exactly what this work needs. So today we want to keep that in mind. Our goal is to focus on how we come together to partner with and resource communities and to learn and follow the lead of those who know those places best. What we do know is that this is not a challenge that any single sector can solve alone. Complex, multi-factor challenges cannot be effectively addressed inside a silo. And that's why we're here today. Today's summit and the roundtable that follows tomorrow is about breaking down those walls. We want to build a greater understanding about what each of our sectors brings to the table and where our work already overlaps and where we can align our investments, policies and relationships. Over the next 2 hours, you'll hear from leaders who are driving this work, practitioners on the ground sharing what community-led, multi-sector climate resilience actually looks like in practice. We'll hear from Monica Valdez-Lupi at the Kresge Foundation on where philanthropy is leaning in and where it needs to go next. And tomorrow, many of you will continue the conversation with us in a roundtable where we'll roll up our sleeves and begin mapping the path to get forward together. So I'll leave you with this from Margaret Mead. Never underestimate the power of a small group of committed people to change the world. In fact, it is the only thing that ever has. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to hand things over to my co-executive director at Build Healthy Places Network, Colleen Flynn. And Colleen will be leading our opening fireside chat with Dr. Manuel Pastor, Director of the Equity Research Institute at the University of Southern California, one of the most important voices in our field on the connections between equity, social movements and climate. So it's a great place to set the stage for today's conversation, and I can't wait to hear what they have to share. So Colleen, over to you.
Thank you, Ruth. I want to pick up one thread before I bring Dr. Manuel Pastor in. Ruth named that when a climate-driven disaster hits, it doesn't just hit one vital condition, it hits all of them all at once. Housing, jobs, food, healthcare, the social fabric of a place. And the depth of the damage tracks the depth of prior disinvestment in those areas. I want to sharpen that point and put it in the center of this next conversation. Climate-driven disasters don't create inequity. They crystallize long-standing inequities with urgency. That's why I'm so glad to be in conversation with Dr. Manuel Pastor. For decades, he has been one of the clearest voices on how race, place, economy, and environment are not separate stories. They are the same story. What I appreciate about his work is that he is, above all, a storyteller and a connector. He draws the lines between things the rest of us tend to put in silo. And he does it in a way that never loses the humanity at the heart of the story. That's a rare orientation. And one quick note before we dive in is we'll have time for audience questions at the end. So as we go, please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A chat. Dr. Manuel Pastor, thank you so much for being with us today. It's a real pleasure. So you've described climate challenges as environmental injustice sped up. Can you open us up by sharing how you're thinking about the nature of the problem we've gathered to address, and what's the frame you want this audience to hold?
Well, good to be with you this morning. Uh, and I'm impressed by how on time everything is in this world. Way to go, Colleen. Um, so uh, the expression kind of came to me. I'd long been working on environmental justice issues with community-based organizations in California. And after Hurricane Katrina, 2005, I teamed up with Bob Bullard, Beverly Wright, and a few others to write a report about Katrina. And what we realized was that there were many Katrinas in slow motion around the country. That is, this combination of disparity by income and by race that left communities vulnerable to toxics on a daily basis and to climate disasters when they occur with the ferocity that they did in New Orleans. But a second thing became very clear to us, which is that the fact that the lower Ninth Ward was not protected, that the levees were not shored up, that this poor black community was viewed as being sacrificial, meant that all of New Orleans was in danger. And that the fact that the lower Ninth Ward was not given its due actually shipwrecked or created a disaster for the entire region. And that is an important thing because often equity is seen as a kind of fairness or inclusion issue, and it is. But it's also true that when you protect the least amongst us, that you will have danger and risk for the majority of us as well. And I think that's important because when I think about the moment that we're in, I tend to think about three interlocking crises. Why three? Well, I'm a lapsed Catholic. Everything comes in a trinity. So here's my trinity of crises. The first is this crisis of multiracial democracy, which is occurring because the country is becoming majority people of color by about the year 2045. It's a prospect that fills some of us with delight. I come from Los Angeles. We became majority people of color in 1988. All I can think is that soon the rest of the country will know the joy of a Korean taco truck. But as you know, what's going on is that in other parts of the country, this prospect of a majority that will be people of color, which, by the way, is not being driven by immigrants, but by the children of immigrants. It's something that's fed into xenophobic and racist politics. The second crisis is the crisis of inequality, and this crisis is quite severe. In the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, about 10% of national income was going to the top 1%. Pretty unequal. But now, instead of 10% going to the top 1%, it's more than 25% going to the top 1%. So the 1% has run away from the rest. And grasping onto their coattails has been a professional middle class that is hoarding opportunity and has moved from an ethos of there, but for the grace of God goes I, to an ethos of I am glad it's not me that is homeless, that is disenfranchised, that is feeling so much of the pain in this current economic crisis of affordability. And of course, the third crisis is the climate crisis, in which we are literally cooking our planet. But what I like to say is that those three crises are connected by one thing: disconnection. Disconnection of a past America from a future America, of an older and whiter generation, from the next generation that needs to be invested in so we can have a productive and prosperous United States. A disconnection so that we look at those who are less economically fortunate and don't think about our mutuality, but think about the way that we have been able to, if we are lucky, escape some of those risks. And certainly with climate, a disconnection from Mother Earth and a disconnection from future generations, or we would be doing the things that we need to do to be able to defend this planet and to defend our peoples and their health for 7 generations to come. So you may think that you are working on climate. You may think that you are working on building healthy places. But fundamentally, it gets back to the diagram that Ruth was showing, that what is missing is civic connection and civic muscle. The idea of seeing each other, seeing our fate in each other, and out of that, the policies come. If you think the problem is that we don't have the right transportation policy, you're wrong. Because it's pretty easy to come up with the right transportation policy. It's much harder to make suburbanites see their fates connected with city dwellers. If you think that we don't have the right housing programs, you're wrong. We know what to do around social housing, inclusionary zoning, affordable housing incentives, rent stabilization, etc. We know what to do. But instead, we've built a system where we guarantee stability for homeowners who are wealthy and sacrifice stability for people who are renting. Our problem is political, it is civic.
Thank you, Dr. Pastor. That's so, so powerful just to think about again that belonging and civic muscle that we all have action we can take and agency there. So switching topics a little bit, you talk a lot about social movements. Could you say more about the role they play in navigating this equity crisis in connection with climate change and how we should think about the relationship between movements, community-led strategies, which Build Healthy Places Network really tries to center, and the sectors that we are trying to bring together in this room: healthcare, public health, community development, philanthropy, and local government.
So, first, I think it's really important to recognize the critical role that social movements play in our resetting my timing so that you don't get mad at me. Um, that we need to understand the crucial role that social movements play in making the world that we have. Um, Women can vote. That's a result of the suffrage movement. We toppled Jim Crow, even if the Supreme Court wants to bring it back. That's the result of a civil rights movement. We are paying attention to climate and the environment. That's the role, or that's the outcome of an environmental movement. That was a reaction to this draconian enforcement around immigration on the part of the Trump administration that is due to an immigrant rights movement that has tried to make us see our fate in each other. So social movements are really important in creating the world that we've got. The labor movement, which meant that for at least for 3 or 4 decades, capital was a little bit more tamed than it has been in the last couple of decades, particularly since the era of Ronald Reagan and neoliberalism. But I think the other thing that we forget is that we tend to think about social movements as being instrumental, that they are the means to attaining an end in terms of policy. And they certainly do that. When you think about reproductive rights, when you think about environmental justice, when you think about transit justice, certainly movements are a means to be able to get something done. But movements are also fundamental. They make us who we are. I'm an economist by training. That's what I got my PhD in. Please do not hold that against me. But one of the things that's really interesting about economists is the following. We talk a lot about markets. And there was a really interesting study that was done looking at students who take economics courses. And what they found out was that if you take more economics courses and you learn about the power of markets and self-interest, you become more selfish over time. That economics teaches you to become the self-interested individual that economics assumes that we are. And what that made me realize, and what we see, is that markets make us selfish. They teach us to behave in ways that are about our own interest. They teach us to be more atomized and individual, to think that the way that we'll solve the climate crisis is by buying our own EV, even as we live in suburbia, as though that EV is a get out of climate jail free card, instead of rethinking our entire urban form and trying to lay out the trails for mass transit that we need to be able to reduce our reliance on any kind of fuel that moves us forward. What movements teach us to do is to be mutual. They teach us to look at someone else whose interests might be a little bit different and think about how do we bridge. They teach us to act in coalitions. They teach us to value multiracial democracy. They teach us, interestingly, to value place. Because when you think about social movements, when you think, for example, about the Mamdani victory recently in New York, it was about social movements because it was about organizing really brought to bear in elections. They really got people mobilized. It was about thinking about central issues that affect people, the economy, affordability, and unlike most people who are progressive, and probably many of us on this call, coming up with simple language rather than complexities about energy, clean economy, stuff that nobody understands, but saying, freeze the rent, make buses free and fast, things like that, that actually resonate with people on a daily basis. But it was also about people's pride in being New Yorkers and saying that New York is a place where people can make it, where people have a right to be, where people have a right to the city. And the cacophony of diversity is a welcome background noise and sight in this beautiful place. So one of the things I would really love to say to you placemakers is that you are movement makers. When you make place, you are making people acquire a particular identity, around place that makes them see each other and creates the possibility for movements for justice and health.
Mm. I love that. I love just thinking about how placemaking is part of our identity work too, and kind of thinking about just reshaping our identity towards solidarity, mutuality. So thank you so much. I guess just moving on, let's get a little bit more concrete about capital and power. A lot of the folks in the audience might hold or move resources. What does it look like to bring finance and philanthropic capital into alignment with social movements and community-led strategies? And how do we keep communities as the drivers when money arrives?
Thank you for the extraordinarily easy question, Colleen. This requires no forethought,
Anytime,
nor
anytime.
forethought at all. Um, the thing that I would lift up is it requires a couple things on both sides. So first, one thing I've been saying to many of my friends in community circles is that it's really critical right now to combine two sets of skills that are often thought about as being on quite separate tracks. One is the skill around building community power to kind of force your way onto the table. Because, equity never really arrives politely. It arrives kicking, screaming, trying to disrupt who holds power, whose voice is heard and not heard. So we need power building strategies. But once you get to the table, it's also important to make sure that you're proposing things that actually pencil out, that we say in Spanish are factible. They could actually happen. And that requires a set of technical skills. That set of technical skills doesn't mean giving up. You know, business frequently says they can't do affordable housing until there's an affordable housing requirement, and they do affordable housing. They frequently say you can't raise the minimum wage, it will create a disaster for employment. And then you raise the minimum wage, employment is stable, working poor are better off. So we need to know how to push the envelope, but you actually need to know what the envelope kind of looks like. So we need to combine community power building with technical capacity on the community side. On the capital side, I think we need to understand something very important. I am lucky enough to hold an endowed chair at the University of Southern California. It's actually well endowed. It came with money. And believe it or not, they actually give you a chair, like a wooden chair. It's that chair right back there, which has got a rather ratty sweatshirt hanging over it, but it's a chair back there. And I once asked the very wealthy guy, center right Republican, who made all the money and endowed the chair, how'd you become so rich? And his answer was, well, I treated my customers right, I treated my workers right, I treated my suppliers right, and it all worked out. And business knows in their bones that in the long run, if you treat your customers right, if you treat your workers right, if you treat your suppliers right, and if you treat the planet right, you will actually be a healthy, sustainable, economically business over time. So we need business to really come back to that epiphany that that's really what is going to drive them forward is to adopt a high road strategy and to look at partnering with community not as a pain in the ass that they need to do to get over some participation threshold that somebody mandated on them, but as a way of getting information so that they can treat their customers right, their suppliers right, their workers right, their communities right, and be able to sustain themselves over time. On the philanthropic side, since you lifted that up as well, I think we need philanthropy to again, like the other two groups, take a track which seems, on the one hand, contradictory. First, philanthropy should be, can be part of civic muscle. That's a group, particularly community foundations, that has a lot of credibility at bringing together multiple sectors. It's the third sector, so it's often viewed as not being quite as devoted to one thing or another, but looking for a productive middle, not a mushy middle, but a productive middle. And that gets to the second thing that philanthropy needs to do, which is to be bold, even as it's trying to be civic. Um, and here, I think it needs to fund some of these community troublemakers. It needs to lift up uncomfortable issues. And it needs to realize that the most dramatic demonstration of civic fabric in the last year or so was the way that the city of Minneapolis stood off the federal government when the federal government tried to overreach with an immigration enforcement dragnet that had no discrimination to it. And that city reacted in a way that was frankly not political, but civic, about protecting their neighbors, about businesses joining in with those neighbors and providing, and this is important for community groups too, multiple entry points. People were able to deliver food to a food bank and feel like they were part of assisting. They were able to take someone, an immigrant's kids, to school to protect them, feel like they were contributing. Some folks went to the streets. Some folks only went there if there was a demonstration. Some decided not to shop on a particular day, but people were given multiple ways to enter. And that's a lesson for your place builders as well. How many entry points are you providing so that when somebody comes to your agenda, they don't have to come for everything or to come for the most down elements. They get to come for what is most comfortable for them to take a first step.
I love that you brought Minneapolis as the example. What an impactful example of community coming together and demonstrating their civic power and muscle. Thank you. So, as we know, not all corporate actors, not all actors are the same. So, how should folks in this audience think about who to engage when they're thinking about climate resilience, when they want to make sure things are community driven?
Not again, I'm really glad you're asking all the easy questions, Colleen.
Yeah.
I think that that is something that we do need to think about. And I think for people who are kind of coming from the community side of things, that there, so I wrote a book a couple years ago. Highly recommend it. Really good book. It's called Solidarity Economics. Um, one of the things about the book is that it's actually on a website, solidarittyeconomics.org. You can download the book for free, and there's a comic book version of the book that's available in English and Spanish for popular education. So, not your normal academic text. Um, Now, I've mentioned it in part because there is a whole movement, important movement, called the solidarity economy. And what the solidarity economy framework kind of says is that, we should be building an alternative economy now. So, worker co-ops, community land trusts, mutual aid, those kind of alternative institutions. And I think that's really important. But we try to talk about solidarity economics by looking at the fact that a lot of businesses actually have mutuality within them and have mutuality between businesses to be able to move forward. It's a lot more mutuality than you think, even in the sort of capitalist part of our economy. Also, if you really want to solve the climate crisis, there's no way a bunch of community land trusts and worker co-ops and mutual aid groups are going to scale up the capital and technology we need to be able to move in a very green direction. So that means those of us who maybe have been uncomfortable working with business need to figure out who it is that we can work with who it is in the clean energy sector. Now, frankly, fossil fuel industry sort of investing in the death of planet, willing to ignore science for decades, not trusted actors. But who is it who's developing alternative energy? Who is it that is moving in the direction of electrification? Doing this, of course, with also a little bit of discretion. I like to mention to people that I'm an early purchaser of an EV. I bought a Chevrolet Bolt in 2017, the first year it came out, because I knew even then Elon Musk was not somebody I wanted to support because he was anti-labor. Tesla was reputed to be anti-black in its treatment of workers. And I thought, I really don't want to be spending my dollars that way. Now, I know a lot of you came around in the last year and a half. Welcome to my world. The Bolt EV, it's not really as good, but you can feel better driving it. So I do think it is a question of figuring out what companies you want to work with. Another book we did just came out a year and a half ago, Charging Forward, looks at Lithium Valley and electric vehicles and the companies there and the difficulties of trying to put together community benefits agreements there and how there's a big tug of war that's going on. It's going to be messy, but we do need to be looking for better actors.
Mm. But sometimes messy brings a lot of good, I think. Yeah. So we want to leave this audience with something to carry into the rest of their day or maybe year. What gives you hope right now?
I was struck by one of the introductions in the chat, who's a fellow person from Pasadena and affected by the climate disaster that was the Eden Canyon fire that took a large swath of Altadena and dipped into particular parts, blocks here and there of Pasadena. Where I live, we were spared. But we own a house in North Pasadena, duplex, that we bought for my daughter, who's a social worker, to rent while she was going to school. Rent. Um, so when the fires came, she evacuated the evening before. Uh, in the morning of, she sent me a picture from her Ring camera showing fires just several houses down from the one that we own. And I thought, texting with her, that this would be the end of this property. Just at that minute, uh, the tenant in the front, Luis, was arriving to the house. Interestingly, because his responsible wife said, "Yes, I know there's a fire, but it's trash day and you should bring the trash cans out." So he showed up, uh, called me, showed me the fire going on down the street, then whipped the camera around and our backyard was on fire. And he and his father-in-law, Arturo, who had just lost his house in the fire 3 hours before, rushed to the backyard with water buckets and eventually with hoses, along with neighbors, including neighbors who broke through fences. Some of our fences had burned down to try to put out what had mounted to a fire that took our carport fences, 3 cars, a shed, etc. My wife got up there about half an hour later. I about half an hour later. We were in different locations, both snuck in under the yellow police tape and joined our neighbors running back and forth from backyard to backyard. If you've ever been in a fire, you know it keeps popping up with hoses and buckets, putting out the fires. And we were lucky because 3 or 4 houses up, the firefighters were staging a big stand against the fire coming our way and protected us. Um, and I take from that story three lessons. First, sometimes when there's a fire, you just have to rush to it. Second, it's better if you go there with your friends and neighbors. And third, it's better if the government is trying to put out the fire rather than trying to fan the flames. What gives me hope is yes, there's a fire. Yes, there are people who are willing to rush to it in this moment. And third, and I hope this audience hangs on to it, that we do need to challenge governing power, that nothing is going to change just by poetic pronouncements or just by our own solidarity. We need to shift policy, and to do that, we need to change the balance of power. What gives me hope is that there are people who are willing to do that. And I think many of them are on this Zoom, and many of them know that they need to do it place by place so that we can build community face by face and we can get over this crisis and find our role together as a beloved community.
Mm. I love that idea too, that deepening your roots locally and connection and advocacy can really support to a larger whole. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Pastor, for everything you've shared. And I know I'm really going to sit with it, and I know the audience will too. So let's bring in the audience. We have had some questions come up, and so I'll share a couple. One is from a government employee working on climate. They're asking on climate, their many government staff are limited to education and research rather than specific programs to action on climate. What role can government staff have in supporting community power building so actions can be taken when we often advocate or support actions directly, when often we cannot advocate for support or actions directly?
That's fantastic. I do think that the whole idea of trying to stay true to the science is really critical. Um, and I say that for everyone. I mean, I think the other thing is that sometimes folks who are progressive will overstate a position. And I've tried, I hope to be forceful but balanced when I challenge whether or not the whole land trust model, which I love, is going to be at scale. That's a pushback about what we sort of need to do. So I think maintaining the science. Um, I also think trying to get government to be really devoted to civic engagement and bringing community voices in, uh, which I know so much of civic engagement often looks like kabuki theater, but I think that a lot of that is because there's not enough of it. That when you spend more and more time getting down to grassroots meetings with grassroots leaders, people are actually quite uh, amenable to trying to find a middle ground that works. When you have very infrequent staged engagement opportunities, you're going to get advocates uh, rather than protagonists.
Thank you. I'm going to combine a couple because they're very similar. So there's two here. How does NIMBYism intersect with affordable housing and climate resilience? How does NIMBYism disproportionately harm low-income communities, people unhoused, climate migrants? And then the similar question is, they're now having a lot of conversations with communities of being displaced by climate. And this means the social fabric might not relocate them within, their existing communities. So how can you think about kind of community cohesion as part of climate recovery and displacement?
Those are both great questions. I tend to think about the NIMBYism as what I was kind of mentioning earlier, the disconnection and the kind of hoarding of opportunity, feeling like I've got mine. I really sort of need to protect it. It's always been striking to me. We lived in Highland Park, and next to us was a informal daycare facility. Yeah, Highland Park is in Los Angeles. And we would have people who are kind of part of our professional circles come by and go, wow, isn't that inconvenient having a daycare center right next to you? And I said, well, we take our kids to a daycare center. So probably ought to be next to someone. Why not us? Um, and I think that the way that we combat this is by trying to involve people in broader movements where they can bridge to others and see their mutuality. Will it work perfectly? No. But I do think that we need to develop those habits and then also at times be forceful at overruling uh, NIMBY interests. Um, this cultural issue is so important. Um, again, uh, going back to the place that I used the example from, Altadena, this was a place where home ownership rates amongst Black folks was 80%. That's twice the national average, about 2.5 times the rate in LA County. And, you know, a lot of people there are having problems rebuilding, didn't have sufficient insurance, maybe didn't have clear title because housing was passed from an elder to someone else without all the right title shifts. Um, but even if they get a financial settlement, they might not rebuild, and what will be gone is the fabric of that community. And we don't put a value on that. And one of the things that I think is going to be a frontier issue, and building healthy places can do it, is to think about what's the value of civic culture? And how do you then sort of build that into public policy to say, you know what, it's worth our extra money in terms of finance and support to be able to ensure that those who might be displaced are not. And there's easy ways to do it. A lot of the risks that people face from displacement have to do with rents rising. Rent stabilization takes care of that. Let's support that as a policy tool, particularly in these areas at threat of gentrification. How do you protect homeowners? Well, many of them need loans to be able to spruce up the properties in line with the neighborhoods changing, or need special programs that can help their heirs be the ones who buy their properties. So a lot of elderly Black homeowners who, yes, they should cash out, but who should be able to move in might be their nephew or niece who may, like a lot of young people, not have amassed the down payment you need in these markets. What can we do to make generational transfers easier by financing it? There's a lot of things we can do if we get creative. The other thing, Colleen, which is very important to folks, has to do with the retail landscape
Mhm.
as well. Um, you know, when you run a carniceria and that opening up down the street is a place selling $7 vegan donuts, that the clientele is changing and you may not be able to survive. And if you don't, there's a whole group of people who are no longer going to feel welcome in that neighborhood because the retail infrastructure is not providing the services and goods they need. So I think placemakers need to pay a lot of attention to incumbent businesses that are part of a
Mhm.
place and what they need to do to be able to capitalize on and survive these shifts in income and demand because they too can benefit.
Mhm. I completely agree with that. And Dr. Pastor, thank you so much for your time and your experience and your perspective. You've given us a frame for today that I think is going to keep showing up. This idea that the work in front of us is fundamentally about reconnection to one another, to place, to future generations, and to communities. Thank you so much. Now we're going to move to practice. To take us there, I'm handing it over to my colleague, Rafael Velasquez, Senior Program Manager at Build Healthy Places Network, who will be moderating our panel on community-driven partnerships in practice. Rafael, over to you.
Thank you, Colleen. What a great way to kick this off with Dr. Pastor. Hi, everyone. I'm Rafael Velasquez. I'm the Senior Program Manager at Build Healthy Places Network, and I'm just really excited to move us into the next part of the conversation. We're going to be hearing from three practitioners who are doing multi-sector work in their communities, each bringing a different perspective to addressing climate-driven disasters in their communities. And with the focus right on communities that have been historically disinvested. And as we learned from our, from Dr. Pastor, the thing is that the communities most impacted by climate disasters are often the same ones that have been left out of the decisions about how to respond. Right? And that's what this panel is really about, not just the coordination between sectors, but really who gets to lead. And we have three amazing leaders here with us today who are doing exactly that in Miami, in Boston, and in Altadena. So we'll start with our first panelist, Zelalem Adefris. Zelalem, if you can please join us on camera. Hi there. Zelalem Adefris is the CEO of Catalyst Miami, a community development organization building power with frontline communities throughout Miami and Dade County to collectively advance justice and achieve shared prosperity. In her work at Catalyst Miami, she has been leading community-driven work on extreme heat, displacement, and climate resilience. And she also serves as the co-chair of the Miami Climate Alliance. Zelalem, welcome. It's great to have you with us. So first, I'd like to start off by asking you, Catalyst Miami has been at the center of community-driven climate resilience work, right? Can you tell us what that looks like on the ground and how it has brought different sectors to the same table?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been here doing this work with Catalyst Miami for this is my 10th year. And so what I would say 10 years ago, basically I was brought on staff to create this grassroots leadership training program on climate justice called CLEAR. It's a free program that's available to community members that goes through like what are the climate issues here in South Florida, what different solutions are, and then building up folks' advocacy skills. And so at that time, when we had first launched that program, the county and the city, they were also just starting their climate work, and we're really, really focused on sea level rise. And our community members have brought up, and like as we're walking through like all the different climate impacts, that sea level rise really wasn't a concern. You know, they're not. Most of the people aren't in, waterfront coastal properties. But extreme heat was the thing that people felt really every single day, whether it was, affording your AC bill and the like financial trade-offs you have to make, whether it's staying cool or, paying for some other basic need, or just waiting. We have a really kind of perpetually late bus system. So waiting outside at an unshaded bus stop for a late bus in the heat and how that impacts health too. And so, yeah, like I would say, we decided we would address extreme heat since that's what our communities are feeling. And when we went to our county to advocate for it, they had said, they had no data on this. So, and then through like various partnerships, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, we were able to get a lot of investment in extreme heat and get the issue finally on the table and addressed. But I think having those initial community conversations through the CLEAR program was key to like focusing on the right issues that really impact people the most. And to be able to get that done. So yeah, I think like that's just one example of what community driven work means from issue identification to then like co-creating solutions together. Um, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So the county was telling you that there was no data on extreme heat, and therefore it wasn't really a problem worth addressing. Yet you were hearing something very different from the community, right? And so from our earlier conversations, we talked a little bit about partnering, right, with Florida International University and how that was really key in terms of developing and really positioning this work as important and a priority for the community, right? So, can you tell us how partnering with, Florida International University and eventually bringing in physicians, researchers, and other community members not only changed that conversation, but also helped build the Miami Climate Alliance, right, into the coalition that it is today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I saw a little comment pop up that says no data, which is so funny. So yeah, like clearly we're in Miami, so it's hot. So you would think that clearly that would make logical sense. Like our basketball team is called the Miami Heat and it's, it's supposed to be like a ferocious team. But they said there was no data on specifically from the health department, because if you think about it, a lot of doctors, if someone comes in with a heat stroke, they're going to say, it's cardiac, whatever. Like the thing that killed them would, they probably won't write heat. They're going to write cardiac arrest. And so at that point from the state health department, there was nothing. And so that's what we were told. Like, we can't work on it if there's no data. At the time, Florida International University was doing citizen science on sea level rise. And so we had to ask the community members that we worked with if they'd be interested in doing citizen science on extreme heat, given that when we went to the county, they said the lack of data was a problem, and they said they want to do that. And so we approached FIU if they would kind of replicate their existing citizen science initiative, but on extreme heat. And they were incredible partners. We didn't have like funding specifically at the time when this started, but they literally like got acquired heat and humidity sensors and like hot glued them to magnets and then trained our community members, and we stuck them in places that were important to people like the park, the bus stop, etc. Um, and basically showed that what our temperature readings are 30 degrees. There was a 30-degree difference in that initial study to what was on the National Weather Service, because they were taking it 30 feet up at the airport and not, on the ground in urban neighborhoods. And yeah, like after that, we got support from Kresge Foundation. We were able to bring in the National Medical Association, and Florida Clinicians for Climate Action, and they talked to physicians about what they're seeing. Because again, that the health department, lack of health department data, because doctors, were not coding it as heat, was also, kind of a barrier. And so they were doing education on that end. And yeah, we were able basically to prove it. And then to get a chief heat officer, which, by the way, the person that asked the question about what government can do, I think government can be like a really, really great friend to community advocates, actually, because even though you cannot advocate as a government employee, in front of a dais, it's just not appropriate. You can ask a community organization if they may be interested in advocating on your behalf. And we had a lot of government staff do that over the years. Even if it's like I put out a study about this like niche thing, but it's really important. Would you mind like spreading the word about this and speaking to the commission about it? It can be a two-way relationship, knowing that we care about communities, we both care about the environment. But anyways, the chief heat officer that we got appointed was the chief resilience officer at the city before and heard our cries about addressing extreme heat and was trying to do it in her capacity as a city employee. So yeah, I like lost myself a little bit there, but that was the kind of the work and the result of the work.
Yeah, thank you for that for sharing that, Salam. And one more question, shifting a little bit. So climate gentrification is a reality in Miami, right? We've heard a lot about how communities of color often, obviously, are the most impacted by these disasters. Communities of color are being pushed out in Miami, not just by like the rising costs of properties, but also literally, right, by the rising seas. How does the work of Catalyst Miami hold housing, displacement, and climate resilience really as one effort, right? Something that is interconnected. Yeah.
Yeah, so we have, similar to our climate justice leadership program, we have a housing justice leadership program. And so we try to weave it. We also have one on health justice too. So we try to weave in the themes of those programs like across programs. And yeah, I mean, so for those that don't know, climate gentrification, so Miami's very low lying. I think our highest point can't be more than 30 feet. And so, but essentially that highest point is along a ridge where the original railroad to Miami was built. And that's when Jim Crow happened to be instituted afterwards. That's where Black communities were forced to move to. And so now that higher ground is being seen, is being speculated because all land in Miami is being developed at an incredible pace, but there's also not as much of a threat of sea level rise as coastal properties. So, and I think when you explain it to community members, people see it every single day. Once you explain all of this in plain language, people really catch on. And so, yeah, in our work, there's that and the education work. And then on the policy side, we're really dealing with a lot of issues with the transfer of public housing to programs like the RAD program, where they're using private landlords and folks are being asked to kind of compete on the private market. And so we've done a lot of work with education with public housing residents and then trying to help navigate folks through this new reality with public housing essentially being privatized.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Lalam. I think what you're speaking to really demonstrates that what you're building, I think, shows what's possible, right? When community organizations, community leaders, right, community comes together and I think really refuse to wait for systems to catch up, right? And for the audience, we'll get to hear more from Zalam in a bit to answer questions from the audience. But now I would like to bring on Dr. Anna Goldman. Hi, Anna.
Hi.
Dr. Anna Goldman is the medical director of climate and sustainability and a primary care physician at Boston Medical Center, a safety net hospital with a deep history of serving communities that have been historically underserved by the healthcare system. In her role, Anna has been leading work at the intersection of healthcare and climate resilience, connecting clean energy, patient health, and community partnerships in a lot of ways that go well beyond the walls of the hospital. Anna, thank you again for being here. So Boston Medical Center has a deep history of serving underserved communities, right? So how did a hospital with that mission end up in the clean energy business? And if you can also share about the clean power prescription model, and some of the key components in that.
Yes, thank you so much, Rafa. And it's just such an honor to be here. Looking at the folks in the audience and all their introductions in the chat is just such an impressive group, and it's It's just a pleasure to speak to this group. So thank you for having me. Um, yeah, so Boston Medical Center has a long history. We opened in the 1860s, the first city hospital in the nation, and really a mission-driven institution even from that time, caring for lower income folks in the south end of Boston. At that time, it was like tuberculosis and typhoid and communicable disease. And it's grown, now we're serving, for different diseases in a much wider range, but still we've maintained that mission. And as you said, I practice primary care. I see adult patients. We serve about a third of our patients. English is, they don't speak English, and many more English is not their first language. The majority have public insurance, so either Medicaid, Medicare, or both. Um, and they're frontline communities primarily. The majority of my patients that I see live in urban heat islands. I think this group is very familiar with that term, but in Boston, it's regularly a 10-degree difference between the neighborhoods where many of my patients live: Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, Chelsea, in the greater Boston area. And I saw some folks from the Boston area. Um, I saw one from CLF. It's really great that you're on this call. So you know about this, and I know this is a problem across the country, and I see the effects of that every day, especially in the summer. Um, but because we serve these frontline communities, yeah, we see it as incumbent upon us to invest in making our operations more sustainable and to reduce our impact on climate change. And our work on this really began in 2011. We were going through a very difficult period financially. I joined in 2019, so I wasn't there for this part. But the hospital brought in a new head of facilities who proposed a huge redesign and overhaul of the campus that would be focused on kind of fixing the financial issue. Many times hospitals will try to cut back on care when they're facing financial headwinds, and this was a completely different plan. It's like, let's build a more sustainable campus, use space more efficiently, and save money that way. And it was a huge success. Really incredible story. So that the person who proposed that and came up with it is currently my boss. His name is Bob Biggio. He's our Chief Sustainability Officer. Um, and the energy efficiency, and then we actually downsized the amount of space our square footage decreased by 8%. But more efficient use of space actually allowed us to care for more patients. And it saved it's saving us about $8 million a year in utility costs, which was a huge win. And then because of changes in real estate, it saved money through that as well. And it really created huge buy-in from the administration and from the leadership for sustainability and energy efficiency, and uh, reduced use of energy, and our reduction in our carbon footprint was a cornerstone of the plan. So because of this buy-in, we were able to do all these other things that really allowed us to become a leader in this space. We invested in solar, both on campus and off campus. And that's also created savings. But we also understood that we needed to bring our patients into this journey, and we'd actually been doing that for a long time. We have a program called Nourishing Our Communities. We have 2 rooftop farms where we grow food for patients. We give it out we have a preventive food pantry where we share the food. And that's been going on for many years. So my work came into this with clean power prescription. That's a model where we have a solar array on campus. It's a 356 kilowatt array where we generate solar energy credits, and those go onto our electric account, and then we transfer them to patients. So they get a credit directly on their bill. These are patients who have utility insecurity. So we screen everyone for difficulty paying bills, utility bills, because it's a key social determinant of health. The idea that non-medical things can lead to worse health outcomes. So we're screening for those things. And then with Clean Power Prescription, we focus on folks with chronic diseases who have Medicaid to ensure that we're reaching the highest needs population. And the solar array supports 80 households at a time. They remain in the program for about 15 months. They get a total of $600 cumulatively in credits. And they also they also are referred to a local social services organization called Action for Boston Community Development. They've been in the community for many years, about 80 years, and they have a number of different divisions addressing different social determinants of health, but one of them is energy. And they help our patients get a sort of a longer term plan for energy security, including making sure they have the discount rate for their utility bills, getting on the LIHEAP program, which is the federal program for heating energy assistance, and then connecting to Mass Save, which is our state's energy efficiency and electrification program. So they are a key partner. And then, of course, the utility is a key partner. So Eversource is the electric utility and gas in where our hospital is located. And they've been a key partner. They're the ones that ensure that the credits are transferred on the back end, and we work with them closely. So it's really a multi-sector effort.
Yeah. So can you share a little bit more about the relationship and really just partnership, right, with an investor-owned utility? Like, what does
Yeah.
it really take to bring this or create this type of partnership, right, and really build something around health and equity goals?
Yeah. So it's been a really interesting journey. It's not where I thought I would be. I guess I shouldn't say this on a webinar, but I was, against the idea of investor-owned utilities. I wanted cooperatively owned utilities, but they've ended up being a really important partner. We do have to troubleshoot with them frequently. Patients move, their account gets disconnected, and we have to figure out how to get them uninterrupted access to the credits. And they also were important for like getting um, a timely interconnection of the solar array done, which is not an easy thing. They also, and that was key to getting Inflation Reduction Act tax credits, which we did also get, and that was so that was a critical partnership. They've also been partners in advocacy projects. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Anna. And I think we have just time for one last very brief question. So, from our earlier conversations, from our prep calls, you were talking about having a vision of patients becoming owner operators, right, of solar rather than just the temporary recipients of credits. Very briefly, like, what would it take to get there, and maybe like what is something that has gotten in the way of making that a possibility?
Yeah, I can't answer this question fully because of time, but yeah, so the idea for clean power prescription came through conversations I was having with Boston Community Solar Cooperative, which is an organization that builds community-owned solar on the roofs of community buildings, and I wanted BMC, my hospital, to lease space to them. And it's a model that continues. I continue to have a relationship with them. There are many things that get in the way. It's now, compared to when we built our first solar array, it's now 4 times as expensive to develop solar. We just looked at developing more. And so there's a long list of barriers, but it doesn't mean it can't happen. And I hope that it does. And I hope to be part of it.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. If folks in the audience have any questions for Anna, we'll be have some time for Q&A at the end. Now I want to bring in Christopher Locke, whose work takes us to the West Coast and into a very different kind of climate change. Hey, Christopher. Very briefly, Christopher is the steward of Collective Unbound, a community-led design and visioning practice working at the intersection of architecture, culture, and community self-determination. Christopher has been working in West Altadena in Southern California following the fires last year, helping a historically Black community lead its own recovery through community-led planning, land stewardship, and placekeeping. Christopher, thank you for being here. We'll jump right into it. West Altadena is a historically Black community with one of the highest Black home ownership rates in the country. It recently lived through a devastating fire. Can you tell us what the community is facing right now and how your work is responding to that?
Yeah, great question. And I just want to say thank you to everyone for taking the time to be in such a great conversation. And hello, let's jump into this conversation. Yeah, I mean, I think as someone who considers themselves a cousin of Altadena, and I'll just say shout out to Dr. Pastor, and as a Pasadena resident, I've been meeting many folks just like you in the DINA, as they call it, the last several months. I say cousin because I'm not from, or nor do I live in Altadena, but I'm someone who cares deeply about the success, the preservation, and ultimately the self-determination of Black and Brown communities. So as someone who, is not only a designer, but also a deeply passionate community organizer, I'm always trying to find ways to bring the knits of things together and finding the kind of margins in which space, people, and community come together, that kind of intersectionality. And when we look at a community like Altadena, specifically West Altadena and the Black community that's been there, the biggest issue that the community is facing right now, and I think Dr. Pastor got at it a little bit, is the erasure that's happening, the displacement, and the fear of preservation. We've seen models of this and examples of this happening in our history for quite a long time. And this happens in communities throughout the country, whether it be even in Pasadena nearby in the 710 freeway and all the communities raised as a part of that. We've seen it even on the east, the I-10, the East Freeway in LA and the West Adams community and all the Black and brown communities that were removed from that. We see all these processes happening that ultimately remove people. And what we've seen now when we have a fire that disrupts not only the lives and unfortunately harms people, we end up in a situation where a decline that was already existing is further accelerated. So in the 1980s, Altadena's Black population maximized to 43%, largely encouraged because of the redlining and some of the other displacement issues and challenges that existed in the rest of LA County. In Altadena, it became a haven for Black communities to come together and build and develop one of the highest, as you said, home ownership rates in the community. So right now, as folks rebuild, there's a significant housing gap of anywhere from $250,000 to $500,000 to rebuild their homes. There is also, as it was mentioned earlier, folks who are elders in the community who are having a hard time finding permanent housing. The money that folks are getting as a part of their insurance, that's running out now. So they're either having to accelerate rebuilding, which already has economic challenges, but they're also having to figure out what happens next even after that, which then leads to the issue and challenge of potentially just selling your property. So 60% of all properties that were damaged during the fires have been sold to outside investors. So folks know, especially in West Altadena, which disproportionately was damaged, 59% of those homes were damaged. We have a population that went from 43% in 1980s down to 18% before the fires. And we're in fear that this community percentage population and representation is going to go further and even lower to below 10%. So what ends up happening when you have a community that's slowly erasing, moving out, factors of pressure, prices were already moving up, you have a community that's ultimately afraid of losing its identity. So there are many mechanisms that folks or community organizers, organizations have been looking at as a way to build back in, as it was called, civic power, which there's a lot of. It's one thing that disasters do. They bring people together. And there was already a strong community in the Denas, but now it's even stronger. So it makes organizing around initiatives that much more powerful because everybody wants to be a part of the movement to move things forward, whether you were impacted by the fire or not.
Thank you. So, one of the aspects of your work, I think that is so interesting and I think so important to rebuilding is really, I think swaying away from the traditional sort of planning process, right? So how does your approach to community engagement, which obviously looks very different from a traditional planning process, help make, community governance, self-determination possible, right? And what does it require from other sectors?
So, just to kind of dive in a little bit deeper, as a part of the work that I'm leading in Altadena with some incredible community organizers and residents and survivors, we're trying to do, I would say, three things that are really important. One, center youth. It's just incredibly valuable. When we do a lot of, and y'all have seen this, when we do a lot of community planning and whatnot, it's a lot of elders. Our elders who have the time, resources, and sometimes the understanding that their presence and the wisdom that they hold as griots of their communities is incredibly valuable. That lived expertise, that history, invaluable. You can't replace it. But what we often sometimes forget is we need the youth to carry those stories and history forward to be the stewards of what happens and comes next. So that is one of the things we're doing. So we have an event on May 13th. I'll drop a link in the chat that is doing that. We're having our youth speak first. And if we can build youth power, if we can build youth civic muscle, then we're creating a pipeline for what the community can be beyond the folks who are recovering. Can we attract Black and brown folks inside of a Black cultural district? And we decided to, the reason why a Black cultural district makes sense because the seeds of that already existed in Altadena. There are, the numbers tell that the incredible artists, the incredible innovators that have existed in this community for such a long time have already been in the seeds of the community. And then when we've seen South LA become one of the first Black cultural districts in California, it just made the most sense as a tool to help accelerate community. And what cultural districts do is they provide some governance. And Altadena, for those who don't know, is an unincorporated community. So LA County is the governing body, more or less, for the community. So the way in which Altadena can get its power, growth, and access in terms of funding comes from LA County. So one of the things that a cultural district does at the state level and at the county level is we're able to flex the muscle of the state power. We have a budget letter out, $5 million that we're hoping to gets through. And also talking to LA County about how land use can be controlled and potentially be used to preserve cultural spaces and build new ones in the county. So it really starts with leveraging lived expertise. I put a budget together for this recently.
Yeah.
$500,000. And a big part of that was, at least a third of that budget was specifically for community expertise, not stipends, but hiring organizations to build more capacity so that they can participate in their fullness.
Thank you, Christopher. And then one final question, just very briefly. So you're talking about how outside investors, right, are buying all these properties since the fires. And thinking about how different sectors can work together, how do land trusts, community development organizations, and, for example, the government, right, need to work together to push back against that?
So land banking is a big one that's happening right now in Altadena. It's led by an organization called Green Line Housing, and other organizations are starting to get into it because if we can hold on to land, even if grandma or auntie or your cousin decides to sell it, it goes back into community's hands. So that's one of the things. The Altadena Earthseed Land Trust, an organization that I've been organizing with, is doing some incredible work as well in terms of acquiring existing properties as well. So I think in terms of, what we can do to stave that off, we're hoping that inside the bubble of this cultural district, that we require developers who are going to build certain things have to show up and talk with community. And one thing that I'll give an incredible credit to the communities of Altadena, specifically West Altadena. Folks understand that they deserve more. One thing that a fire does or disaster does, it makes you realize that your community deserves a lot more than it was already receiving. So that abundance, the ability to see something and the ability to grow now is something that folks really are grasping onto, not just because that this community deserves it, but because we understand that we deserve something greater as Black and brown people when we come together.
Got it. Thank you, Christopher. Now I want to bring back Zelalem and Anna. If you can please join us on camera. We have a few minutes. We're a little bit over time, but I think we have some really great questions in the chat from the audience. So one is, and any of you can answer this. What are your thoughts on AI usage on the climate sustainability cause, right? And the question says, one of the AI company founders sees AI as a possible utility in the future.
Yeah. Anyone want to go for that?
I can. I'm definitely not an expert.
Go for it.
Okay. All right. I'll take a stab. I mean, I think, AI is a double-edged sword. Right now, it's inflating utility prices a lot because it's competing for power, and we already needed to build out our electric grid to allow for electrification of communities, and now this is a huge competitor for that power. Um, I think there will be some positive benefits like better management of the grid can help, can be achieved with AI and possibly advancing new technologies around clean energy. But overall, I'm not the most optimistic, I should say.
Yeah, what I jump in there is exactly what Anna was getting at, is that the difficulty, what we're running into is like these are very powerful tools. And I've been in a AI rabbit hole about 3 weeks ago. I just came out. And that, these tools are rapidly multiplying and teaching themselves faster than we know. Everyone thinks, oh, that's 15, 20 years from now. No, it's more like five. Between AI and genetics and all these other tools, they're going to be not only taking our jobs, but they're going to be an integral part of our work, whether we like it or not. And the dangerous part about it is not only is it impacting our ability to learn and connect, but it makes what we're doing today, even though we're doing it on a computer, the human connection that much more valuable. And that is, I think the thing that this community and this network is really leveraging. But I also think we have to figure out how to make these tools leveraged for the work we're doing while making sure we're somehow figuring out the issue that Anna talked about, whereas it relates to power. Because what's going to end up happening very much is we're going to have other countries that want access to the wealth that comes from building these data centers, countries in the Middle East, places in Africa, places in Asia, even inside our own country. We've seen it happen in Michigan, where communities are getting frustrated with these data centers being built because now they become an extractive tool, just like lithium is extractive in the Lithium Valley or Imperial Valley in California. This is the new thing. And we're unfortunately in a situation where, you know, shoot, cloud is being used right now to generate this damn conversation, and we need it, but we need to figure out how to ultimately monitor it and push back as a community. That information is incredibly valuable.
Thank you. Zalam, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I'm a little bit of a Luddite, so they answered it much better than than I could, and I agree.
Got it. So another question says, for Zalam or others, in regard to climate gentrification or other forms of climate-related displacement, do you see climate adaptation as a major driver of displacement? And where do you see entry points, right, for combating these displacement processes in a rapidly developing urban environment?
Right now in Miami, I don't see climate adaptation as contributing so much to displacement. The county has tried a couple times, and some of the cities have tried to do some managed retreat, which is basically essentially buying out properties and turning them into parks, because they're like repetitive flooding areas. But it's so far has been unsuccessful just because the neighbors, it's hard to sell neighbors like, um, on what's going to happen to their neighborhood if there's not a comprehensive plan. But I think as those things become, I know of a few attempts over the years, but as those things become more pertinent and more real, we may see some of that. Mhm.
Thank you, Zalam. And I have one last question just to close us off, and any of you can answer this. We talk a lot about physical infrastructure and climate resilience, right? We talk about housing, energy, green space, and so on and so on. But each of your models, from what I was hearing you as you were speaking, seems to be building something like harder to see sometimes, right? Which is like community trust, social cohesion, collective relationships, right? And so on. Like, how do you think about that as infrastructure? And what does that require, right, from healthcare institutions, community development, or other sectors at the table?
I think from my perspective as someone who, is organizing, and it's funny, not only building buildings, but building the civic infrastructure that is needed in order to create self-determination and sustainability. And I think, that's all been said earlier. I think the thing that, as someone who thinks about systems and whose organization is really centered on the system wasn't built for us, so we have to build differently. We have to support alternative methods of work, but also look at our history for things that have existed that we can leverage and make better. And I think in the work that we're doing right now, like in Allensworth, which is a Black historic community in the Central Valley, is gathering a lot more resources to build themselves back up. It's a community of only 500 people, but it was one of the first self-governed and founded Black communities in 1908 in California. Incredible rich history. We look at Watts and the Watts Towers. We look at all these communities. There's so much rich knowledge that communities already have. How do we create the power pathways to support that work so that the professionals and organizers who just need the resources to do it have the abundance mindset? I took on investors to start my organization as a social enterprise. I've never would have done that before unless I had really strong mentors who were able to give me the support and understanding what that looks like. It still has its challenges. It still has its difficulties. The work I'm doing at Altadena is not funded. I'm just doing it. We're just doing it. We're just going to figure it out. We're going to find the money. We're just going to do it. But I think not everybody has that perspective or even has that willingness to do that. So how do we capitalize the interests, dreams, and expertise of folks and not allow that just to be something that's dissuaded? So that's the one thing that I would definitely say is people have to also see the support they need in order to continue to do the work.
Anna, Zalalem, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I'd just say that I think how we do the work is as important as the work itself because the biggest driver of the climate crisis is like a culture of greed, right? Like whether it's one thing or the other, it's being extractive, right? And so it's probably better in our solutions that we don't mirror that like in the work that we do going forward because it's not just greenhouse gas emissions, it's like how we treat the earth, how we treat each other, right? They go hand in hand. So yeah, that's what I'd say. I think it's important to pay attention to how it is that we do the work. And yeah, I think trust and the pace at which we move and yeah, like the good faith is important.
Anna?
Sure, I'm happy to. It's hard to go after Zalalem and Christopher because they're both incredible. But I mean, I think in our, we're lucky because we're a huge institution that's been there forever, and I have been lucky enough to be able to jump into this work with the hospital as my context. And so, continuing to deepen that trust by showing patients that we do care about this issue has just been a privilege, and being able to do it in such a way that engages them, that isn't just kind of behind the scenes, has been incredibly meaningful.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Zalam. Thank you, Anna. And thank you, Christopher. I think one of the things that really strikes me the most from this is really that none of this really started with like a policy or like a program, right? It really started with you all, right, at your communities, paying attention to what people needed and really doing something about it. So thank you again. Really appreciate you all being here. And we're going to keep this conversation going. In our next segment, our co-executive director, Ruth Thomas Swans, will be speaking with Monica Valdez-Lupi, Managing Director of Health Programs at the Kresge Foundation, to really walk us through a conversation about what philanthropic investment in this kind of work looks like. And with that, I'll pass it on over to you, Ruth, and thank you all.
Thank you so much, Rafa. What an amazing panel, and thank you to everyone for sharing their wisdom and insight there. As Rafa mentioned, it's my pleasure to welcome Monica Valdez-Lupi, Managing Director of Health Programs at the Kresge Foundation. Monica is a public health leader with over 20 years of experience spanning local, state, and national roles, including things like the Executive Director of the Boston Public Health Commission, Senior Advisor to the CDC Foundation. So welcome to the summit, Monica.
Thank you so much, Ruth, and thank you for hosting this important summit for us.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. I'm glad you could join us. So, we've talked a little bit today around climate-driven disasters being impossible to ignore. And for many of the folks who've joined in the chat and even on our panel, they've arrived quite literally on their doorstep. So we have heard that they're hitting harder. But we do know that these disasters don't hit everyone equally. We talked a little bit about spatial justice with the vital conditions and the distribution of those factors. And more to the point, not every community will have that buffer of resources and community investment to recover in the same way. So as we're sort of beginning to think about this role of multi-sector, community-led approaches, from your vantage point as a funder, what are you seeing right now that points to the need for a fundamentally different response in this moment compared to what we've done in the past?
Thanks for that first question, Ruth. And thank you to Zelalem, Dr. Goldman, and Chris for that panel, because I think we began to hear in terms of community insights. And so I wanted to start there and pick up the thread. Something that we've learned through our work at the foundation and from the communities that we've been partnering with is that climate change doesn't show up as climate change. It shows up as asthma, it shows up as heat stress, it shows up as flooding in your home or anxiety after repeated disasters and not being able to return home. And you said that in your framing remarks. And so when we say climate change is a public health issue, that's not a framing choice. It's the lived reality of communities, low wealth, and communities of color that have been on the receiving end of being disinvested, as we've heard throughout the summit today. And in philanthropy, we still tend to fund these issues separately. So climate over here, public health and health here, equity maybe in another program. And this had been the case at Kresge, despite our team, the health program, having made grants to different climate and environmental justice organizations, and our environment team making similar grants to their community-based partners and health partners as well. And so, what we've been trying to do with our climate change and health equity initiative is to connect those dots in a much more intentional way and across multiple programs at the foundation. And you got to hear a little bit about the amazing work that Zelalem has been leading with her organization in Miami.
That's amazing. And building on that, actually, so as you said, you've invested across a wide range of community-led approaches across different geographies, I know, from Fresno to Texas and elsewhere. So when you've seen those emphases, what are some of the common threads you see in the ones that have worked best? Is it around governance? Is it around partnerships or trust building? Could you share just like a little more concretely about what success could look like?
Yeah, so I'll share a couple different examples, and this came up in Dr. Pastor's chat with Colleen in terms of context and how place really matters in terms of potential partners, community partners, and networks on the ground, and potential solutions where we're able to accelerate their efforts. And so for us, when we look at community-led work in our climate change portfolio and our initiative, the residents aren't just consulted. They are they are driving in shaping how to define the problem, the different solutions, the data, and the different stories that can be elevated to do the case making, to change policies and systems, and to hold institutions accountable. So in Fresno, we see examples of residents and youth, young people who are using citizen science, air quality data, organizing, and public testimony to influence transportation, the spatial design that you mentioned, land use, and environmental justice decisions at that in the Central Valley. In New Orleans, we have community partners who are using community water planning, food and climate planning, and cultural resilience and anti-displacement efforts to help neighborhoods do the important planning and preparedness for flooding, heat, and other disasters in the Gulf Coast. And in Memphis, we have partners who are building resident leader leadership through neighborhood hubs, food access, green infrastructure, workforce pathways, and health partnerships. And I thank you for the shout out from Deyanira at Barhai for our friends in Fresno who are fighting data centers in their community. And so the common thread is that we have in our climate change, health, and equity initiative trusted organizations and partners that are serving as the bridge between residents and institutions in their communities. And they're doing amazing work to translate their lived experience into policy, planning, and public health and infrastructure decisions. So when we begin to think about through lines and what success has looked like, and we're going in, by the way, into a second 5-year phase with the initiative, three things that I wanted to share. First, and this should resonate because I think Dr. Pastor said this also, that residents have power, and through the initiative, they've learned how to use this incredible power. So they are part of a cohort and a network that is trained, organized, being compensated and supported to advocate for their neighborhoods and stay engaged. Beyond just one single meeting or convening, they're part of a learning community. Second, our national partners. So we have 25 community-based network partners and 7 national partners. And our national partners are working in institutions and represent institutions. So we know that the second lesson is that institutions have begun to change how they work. So public health agencies, public partners, health partners in hospitals and community health centers and funders begin treating community priorities as central and foundational to the planning and in the investment and efforts of time, not just an afterthought. And third, I would also share that community priorities have become more visible in just daily life. And so it can look like cleaner air, it can look like shade canopies being planted, safer streets, better food access, reduced flooding, mutual aid being invested in, local green jobs and economic mobility and healthier neighborhood conditions to tie back to what you had lifted up in terms of vital conditions and just that civic engagement and that social cohesion, which is really important for sustainability.
Yeah, I mean, wow, that's just amazing. So a real breadth of interventions there. And I think it sort of a lot of it speaks to what you mentioned about building capacity within communities and a sort of and that bridge you mentioned between residents and institutions. And I think we're trying to create this fabric or infrastructure for partnership, right? That will sort of really smooth that path. That's really interesting. So I know one of the things that has come up in our conversation is this idea, and you've touched on it a little bit about the importance of narrative. And that we sort of recognize that how we tell the story of climate and community matters enormously to case making, but also that aspect of power building and sort of even in community healing through arts and culture. And we sort of heard a little from Dr. Pastor that mention of our disconnection problem and the power of placekeeping in this ecosystem. So I was wondering, could you share a little bit about more where you've seen the importance of narrative play out with some of your partners in this work?
Sure. And in the first part of the initiative, the first 5 years, we had partnered with Met Group to support our cohort in terms of strategic communication. So how do you talk with partners who may not share that same view? And so in this second phase or this next phase of the initiative, we've been able to bring into the investment colleagues from our arts and culture team who are really at the forefront in terms of the role of culture and cultural bearers and cultural strategy to build narrative and to support movement building. And so we see culture and narrative in and of themselves as critical strategies in the work and not just a communications tool. They help communities, as you shared and others have already said, name what they're experiencing and connect climate to to their daily lives, and then move from individual stories to collective action. And so, a couple examples that I wanted to just highlight. In San Diego, our partners have worked on the 10 transit lifelines, which have been community identified priorities for improving public transportation with a very explicit focus on equity, affordability, and frequency. And so they've partnered with through an environmental health coalition. And this is the importance, I think, of coalitions and narrative and movement building to really connect and elevate the voices of community members to drive changes. And they've brought young people to talk about youth opportunity passes. They've talked about free transit by 2030, having pedestrian safety and safer streets for bikers and walkers and anti-displacement strategies. Another example from my home state of Massachusetts is the Public Health Institute of Western Massachusetts and their partnership with Live Well Springfield, which really brought in residents, community partners, city staff, and their city council to build support for community choice energy that was adopted in 2022. So just, two examples there, and you can find more on the Kresge Climate Change, Health, and Equity Initiative link, which we can drop in the chat. But again, narrative is important in terms of power building and also in supporting the healing from these most urgent climate threats that people are experiencing and then building a better future.
Great. Yeah, that's so powerful, really moving as a bridge between the crisis to the healing too. So we've talked about the urgency, and there is a sense of urgency around this. So we get a sort of community-led efforts often face challenges around the issue of scale in the face of that. And sometimes institutions can characterize community-led efforts as sort of being niche, sort of more closely associated with programming, and not being identified as being scalable or even generalizable to the sort of systems level change that we know that we need. What do you think about this tension, whether it's real or perceived, between the operation of community leadership in our climate solutions and that desire for scale?
We have this conversation at the foundation with our arts and culture, environment, and our Detroit and American cities teams, and with our partners. And we talked about this in terms of this balance and this tension. And in a recent conversation with staff, we thought, well, maybe tension's real, but maybe we're framing it the wrong way. Because when we think about, or oftentimes when community-led work, it can be dismissed as too local or too specific. And so when we look at our theory of change, we really treat local leadership as the foundation for systems change, not a barrier to it. So when we think about scale, it never has to be copy and paste, right? Because scale has to be having different examples and models throughout the country is helpful because it's not strictly about replication. And with our national partners and field building, that also helps accelerate in terms of how we amplify the bright spots that are happening in local places and communities. And so when we're thinking about what we're trying to scale, maybe focusing on how do you scale examples and effective examples and successful examples of power, trust, governance, and accountability and better climate health practice, then it makes sense that we start in place with communities driving the work, because that's honestly where the work is getting done. And you said it with your Margaret Mead quote, right? It starts with a few people, and then you can then take those elements that I just talked about and what we see, what our frontline community partners are doing every day, and helping to invest and accelerate their work.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. So as we're going to close out, I'd love to very briefly just look a little to the future. You're working inside a very influential institution. What would you say, candidly, that philanthropy needs to do differently or to authentically support community-driven and multi-sector climate resilience right now? We often hear about responsive and flexible funding coming up, but I'm also curious if there's anything else, structural or even cultural, that also needs to shift.
I think in terms of three things that I would share in cultural shifts in the field in our sector. First is that, there are foundations who are beginning to learn how to share their power with communities. And that means communities identifying and setting the priorities and the strategies, communities defining what success means to them and what are those signals of progress so that we in philanthropy can figure out ways to shape the resources to support that work. I also think in terms of evaluation approaches, in terms of sharing power, this idea of, trust building and emergent learning is also as important as health outcomes and ultimately policies being passed. You mentioned the second one, which is, yeah, f flexible funding and general operating support matters. But there is something in addition to flexible funding, and that's multi-year, support, simpler applications and reporting, quick access. So in this iteration of Chi, we've been able to pull together funding across 5 out of our Kresge programs to create a flexible and responsive funding pool so that grantees can tap it when conditions change quickly. And then the third is I think that we as funders need to invest in community-led work, just full stop. And local, we're fortunate because we have 4 places, so that helps us in terms of places, but the initiative and the work is national. And so we know that local work shapes policy, public health infrastructure, and investments, and we have a way to fund those connections and those networks, and to make it possible for communities with shared purpose and aligned values actually drive action and hold their institutional partners accountable to their efforts. And so those were the three things that I would elevate as
Yeah.
lessons for other funders.
Thank you so much for sharing. That's super interesting. And just thank you so much for the conversation, Monica.
Thank you, Ruth.
Yeah. So I'm now going to hand the mic over to my colleague Mariana Arcaya, who's Professor of Urban Planning and Public Health at MIT. Over to you, Mariana.
Thank you so much. I volunteered myself for the nearly impossible but very exciting job of summarizing, what were the key themes that we heard today. And I want to thank everybody for spending 2 very precious hours with us. I hope that you're coming away with new ways of thinking about the challenge of navigating climate-driven disasters, new solutions that may not have been on your radar screen, new ideas for sectors and organizations that you might want to partner with in the future, and renewed energy for the incredibly critical work that everyone on this call is doing. Listening to the speakers and the panelists today, it's clear that countering the threats from climate-driven disasters will require the expertise of community leaders, clinicians, health systems, planners, organizers, researchers, funders, government, and particularly the power of those sectors coming together. And I think today was a really great start in helping us expand our vision of what resilience can look like, but also focusing our attention on the crucial elements that are going to move us ahead. And so I know there are so many great ways we could try to distill 2 hours of very rich conversation, but I'm going to take a swing at this through offering 6 P words that I heard centered today. So the first P word I'm going to offer is place. And this is not surprising given that Building Healthy Places Network brought us together today. And thank you again, Ruth and Colleen, for doing this. It's been incredibly powerful. Many of us came here today knowing that we need solutions for places or as leaders in actually building resilience in specific places. And I think Ruth's opening remarks, really offered us a way to think about places as the actual physical location where the seven vital conditions intersect with each other and with the specific history of places and people within those places. But I was really struck by Manuel Pastor's very powerful point that focused on the relationship between places and movement, and the fact of civic muscle being at the center of the seven vital conditions graphic that Ruth showed us to start off our afternoon. Um, I love this remark to all of us on this Zoom call. You placemakers are movement makers that makes people see each other and creates the possibility for new movements. So I think that this idea of we're focusing on places and in place making and place keeping, we are also creating new possibilities for movements that will help us create and keep those places that are so important. Was a really powerful point and a powerful reflection on the role of place. The second P word is partnership for me today. I hope everyone here loved as much as I did getting to hear concrete stories about cross-sector work and how what might seem like unexpected partners came together in many cases to create really innovative solutions. I loved Zelalam's story about working with academic partners to create data, and then working with healthcare partners after that to then create a government role in a chief heat officer to serve Miami. I loved hearing from Anna about doctors working with investor-owned utilities. And so some of the partnerships we got to hear about today showed how sectors and people in roles that may not usually be discussed together can create really innovative solutions in the face of climate-driven disasters. The third P word is actually a chance for me to sneak in a double P word, which is going to be people power. Or I could say people and power, but people power together, which I think today we underscored the need to recognize the expertise of people who are living in places that have experienced disaster, people who are at risk of climate-driven disasters, communities that are bearing a disproportionate burden from climate-driven disasters as experts on those, on the solutions that we need. And as Alalam told us, including issue identification and co-creation of solutions together. Dr. Pastor reminded us that about power, that equity does not arrive politely, it will arrive kicking and screaming, and that we need power building solutions and that people power is at the heart of this. And I love the remarks from Monica Valdez-Lupi, who pointed to another P word in relation to people power, which is priorities. People need power over the priorities that are focusing our work in this space. The fifth P word I will offer, the fourth P word I'm going to offer is practice. I'm absolutely struck by the richness and the variety of what practice in the area of resilience in the face of climate-driven disaster looks like, ranging from our panelists talking about citizen science for heat monitoring, combating climate gentrification, prescribing clean power as a way to meet the utility needs of patients and reduce health hospital costs and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, rooftop farms, working on cultural districts, working with youth, working on narrative. And then looking at the chat, there's just so much richness in what is actually happening on the ground. And it strikes me that we have so much to learn as a community of practice by actually examining what are all of us doing here. And so I think today was a great start in helping us see what everyone else is doing. The next P word will be philanthropy. I loved Monica's points about philanthropy playing a role not just of funding, but also connecting dots, connecting geographies, and helping create that bridge for residents to translate lived experience into planning and policies, and connecting people to institutions. I thought that was such a powerful take on the role of philanthropy. And I will end with my final P words, which will be positive visions and possibilities. I know this is where we're going to go tomorrow. Many of you are joining us for a roundtable tomorrow where we are going to be continuing the conversation, talking about our positive visions, possibilities for the future. And so for those of you who will be with us tomorrow, we will pick up the conversation tomorrow. And for those of you who are just joining us today, please stay tuned for more resources on this topic from Build Healthy Places Network. I believe there is a survey that someone is going to drop into the chat that we would love for you to take. And I will thank you again for spending 2 precious hours with us. It's been wonderful.